The first thing I heard was the horn, and the second thing I heard was a man's voice telling me at the top of his lungs that I was nobody. He had stopped his low silver car nose first against my cordon, and he had his window down and his head out of it, and he was screaming a single idea over and over as if volume could make it true. Open the road. Open the road right now. You have no idea who I am. Behind that fixed face of mine, eyes forward, chin level, I will tell you exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking that the road was not mine to open, that it had never been mine to open, and that no amount of noise from him would change the one fact he could not bear. The road belonged that morning to the dead. It was a remembrance morning, the kind we plan for a year. The avenue we call the King's Mile had been closed since before dawn. I had stood my length of the cordon for 2 hours by then, white tape and steel barrier and a row of cones, and across the avenue the procession was forming up out of sight, the slow drums not yet started, the wreaths stacked under canvas against the damp. My orders were as plain as orders get. Hold the line. Let nothing through but what the marshal waves through. Be the wall and let the wall be polite and let the wall be silent. I had turned away a delivery van with a word and a pointed glove. I had redirected 3 taxis, a courier on a bicycle, and a tour group who only wanted a photograph and got one, of my back. None of them had argued past the second sentence, because most people, when they meet a closed road and a man who plainly is not going to move it, do the arithmetic and go around. The silver car did not do the arithmetic. The silver car had decided the arithmetic was beneath it. He got the horn going again, 3 long blasts that bounced off the stone fronts of the bank and the old assurance offices, and a few faces turned in the thin crowd behind me. I kept my eyes on the middle distance, where they are trained to stay, and I let the horn wash over me the way rain washes over a statue. That is the part people never understand about the post. The stillness is not me being empty. The stillness is the hardest work I do. Every blast of that horn was a small invitation to turn my head, to lift a hand, to say the thing a tired man wants to say, and the discipline is in declining every one of those invitations, one after another, for as long as the post requires. The car door opened. I heard it over the horn, the particular heavy thunk of an expensive door, and then his shoes on the wet road, quick and hard, and then he was in front of me. Tall, well-fed, a good coat thrown over weekend clothes, a watch that probably cost more than my year, a face gone blotchy with a fury that had clearly been building since the first barrier he'd met streets back. He planted himself in my eyeline, close, closer than any stranger has a right to stand, and he jabbed a finger up toward my chin. "Are you deaf?" I said. "Move it." "I have somewhere to be." I said nothing. I am not permitted to debate the public from the post, and even if I had been, there was nothing to debate. He had somewhere to be. The 11 names that were about to be read at the far end of the King's Mile had somewhere to be too, a long time ago, and they had gone and they had not come back, and that was the whole reason the tape was up. I let my silence answer him, because silence, held correctly, is an answer. It was the wrong answer for him. Silence, to a man like that, is the one thing that cannot be allowed, because it means his volume is not working, and if his volume is not working, then the world has stopped arranging itself around him, and that is a kind of falling. I watched it happen in his face. The fury sharpened into something meaner. "You think you're better than me, standing there in your costume." He flicked his fingers at the front of my tunic, not quite touching, testing the line. "It's a road. It's a public road, and I pay for it, and you are going to move that barrier or I will have your job by lunchtime. Do you hear me? By lunchtime." A young marshal in a high-visibility vest had drifted up the pavement, drawn by the noise, and I caught him in the corner of my eye. He was new, I think. He had the careful look of a man who has been told what to do but never had to do it with a real angry person filling the air. I willed him to stay back and let the morning's chain of command do its work. We had police at both ends of the avenue. We had radios. The right thing was for the marshal to call it in and for me to hold. and for the storm to spend itself against the wall the way storms do. The man turned his head and saw the marshal too, and decided in the way these men decide that the marshal was the soft target. He rounded on him. You're in charge of this circus. Open this road. I've got a meeting that's worth more than this entire, and he waved a hand at the cones, the tape, the canvas-covered wreaths, this entire piece of theater. Sir, the road's closed for the service, the marshal said, and his voice cracked on the second word. There's a diversion 2 streets back if you... I'm not going 2 streets back. The roar of it startled a pigeon off the bank's ledge. Do you know how long I've been sitting here? 40 minutes. For what? For a parade. For some old men and a brass band. And there it was, the thing he should never have said, within earshot of the crowd, within earshot of me. I felt it go through the people behind the tape, a small cold change in the air, the way a room changes when someone insults the host at his own table. An older woman near the barrier had a poppy on her coat and her hand had come up to it. A man beside her had stopped filming the procession that wasn't there yet and turned his phone, quietly, toward the silver car and the shouting man. I clocked all of it without moving a muscle. The post teaches you to see everything and show nothing, and I was seeing everything. What I want you to understand, before I tell you what he did next, is that I was not angry. People assume we are seething behind the discipline, biting it down, and sometimes that is true, but that morning it was not. I had stood that avenue for 10 years. I had stood it in heat that softened the tar and in cold that numbed my hands inside the gloves. I had stood it for weddings, and for funerals, and for one terrible afternoon I will not put in this account. A man in a good coat who thought a closed road was an insult aimed personally at him did not reach the part of me where anger lives. He reached only the part of me that had a job to do, and the job was simple. Hold the line. Let the system come. But the man had stopped negotiating with the system. He had decided the system was me, and that if he could move me, the road would open, and the dead could wait, and the meeting could be made. He turned back from the marshal, and he came at me, and I saw his hands come up, and I knew that the morning was about to stop being about a horn. He shoved me. Both hands flat against my chest, a hard double push with his weight behind it, the kind of shove a man gives when he has stopped seeing a person and started seeing an obstacle. I will tell you that he was not a small man and that he knew, in some animal part of him, how to throw his weight. I will also tell you that I had spent 10 years learning to take exactly that and give back nothing, and so I gave back nothing. My heels were set. My core was set. I rocked perhaps an inch and came back to the vertical like a post that has been kicked, and my eyes never left the middle distance, and my hands stayed where they belonged. That more than anything is what undid him. He had put his whole self into the shove, expecting either that I would stumble, which would have proved I could be moved, or that I would shove him back, which would have made me the brawler and him the victim and turned the whole thing into a fight he could narrate later. I gave him neither. I gave him a wall. And a wall does not flatter a man's strength. It only measures it and finds it wanting. Move. His voice had gone ragged now. He shoved me a second time lower, trying to find the angle that would break my stance. And again I took it and held, and again I came back to the vertical. A sound went through the crowd, not a gasp exactly, more a collective drawing in of breath, the sound people make when a line they assumed was sacred turns out to be one a stranger is willing to cross. The man with the phone had both hands on it now, steady, framing the silver car's plate and the shouting man and the unmoving guard all in one shot. 2 more phones had come up beside his. The morning was being recorded by people who, 10 minutes earlier, had only come to see a parade. Here is the thing about being shoved on the post that the videos never quite capture. The hardest part is not the contact. The hardest part is the half-second after, when every instinct you own is screaming at you to set it right, to step in, to put the man on the ground, because you can, because you have been taught how, because he has earned it. That half-second is where the whole job lives. I have heard people say discipline is about following orders, and that is the small part of it. The large part of it is the half-second, the gap between what you could do and what you are going to do, and what fills that gap is not fear and not weakness. What fills it is the certainty that the moment I lay a hand on this man, the morning becomes about a brawl between a guard and a driver, and the 11 names at the end of the avenue lose their mourning to him. He had already tried to steal the road. I was not going to hand him the story as well. So I held. I let him shove a wall, and I let the wall be silent, and I let the cameras see precisely what was being done and precisely who was doing it. The marshal had got his radio up at last, his hand shaking, and I heard him say the words that mattered. Assault on a guard, north end of the mile, silver car blocking the cordon, requesting officers now. The system was coming. I only had to be the wall until it arrived. The man heard the radio too. Something flickered behind the fury, the first thin draft of cold air through the heat of it, the dawning sense that this was being witnessed and logged, and that the witnesses were not on his side. For one breath I thought he might fold, get back in his car, reverse the way the marshal had told him to. A wiser man would have. But arrogance has a momentum of its own, and a man who has already shoved a guard twice in front of a crowd cannot easily decide that he was wrong, because deciding he was wrong means standing in the wreckage of what he just did. It is easier for that kind of man to go further, to be louder, to be right by being worse. "You won't even look at me," he said, and his voice had dropped now, gone low and ugly, which is always more dangerous than the shouting. "Fine. Let's see how the costume looks when it's on the ground." He stepped to my side fast, and his hand closed on my upper arm, and he hauled, trying to drag me bodily off my position, off the cordon into the road. I felt the strength of it run down through my boots into the wet tarmac. And I felt, too, the exact place where the line is drawn between what a guard endures and what a guard answers. Being shouted at is endured. Being shoved is endured within reason while the system comes. But a man hauling on my arm to drag me off a cordon I am charged to hold is no longer an insult to my pride. It is an attempt to breach the line itself, to clear the path by removing the obstacle. And the obstacle, that morning, was the only thing standing between a moving vehicle and a route that in 90 seconds would fill with marching men and a brass band and an old woman with a poppy. That changed the arithmetic, not for my pride, for the post. I moved. Not a brawl, not a blow, nothing the cameras would ever be able to call a guard losing his temper. I did what 10 years had drilled into the meat of me, which is the smallest correct thing. I turned into him, broke his grip on my arm with a single clean rotation that a man twice his size could not have held, stepped my forward foot to reclaim my ground, and brought myself square again on the cordon between him and the road, my rifle still shouldered, my free hand open and low, my voice level and just loud enough to carry to the marshal and the crowd and the man himself. "Step back behind the line, sir. The road is closed." It was the first thing I had said to him. 8 words, low and flat, no anger in them, and I think the absence of anger was what staggered him more than the words. He had been bracing for a shout to shout back at. He had been hoping for it. A man who screams wants the other man to scream so they can be the same animal in the same fight. What he got was a sentence delivered the way you'd read a weather report, and it landed on him like a verdict. He stumbled back half a step, more from surprise than from the broken grip, and stared at me as if I had grown a second head. Then he looked down at his own hands, and then he looked at the crowd, and I watched him see the phones. Really see them. 4 of them now, maybe 5, all turned his way, all steady. A woman near the front had her free hand pressed to her mouth. The marshal had stepped between the man and the barrier, arms slightly spread, doing the brave, foolish thing the young do, and was saying, "Sir, you need to wait for the officers, sir, just wait there," in a voice that was finding its feet at last. And from the far end of the King's Mile, faint and then less faint, the drums began. You have to understand what that sound does on a remembrance morning. It is slow. It is deliberate. It is the oldest cadence we have, the one that says, "Here come the living to remember the dead, make way, be still." The crowd heard it, and the last of their attention to the shouting man evaporated. They turned as one toward the sound, lifting onto their toes, and the older woman with the poppy began, very quietly, to cry, the way people do at that drum beat whether they mean to or not. The whole avenue tilted toward the coming procession. Everything in the world had made way for that drum. Everything except the man in the good coat, who could not hear it, because the only sound in his head was still the sound of his own thwarted mourning. "Don't you walk away from me," he said, though I had not moved an inch. He came forward again past the marshal, and the marshal grabbed his sleeve and the man tore it loose, and there was a scuffle of bodies. The marshal half pulled off his feet, and the man's elbow came back and caught the young marshal across the cheekbone. Not a punch, but hard enough. And the marshal sat down on the wet road with his hand to his face and a look of pure astonishment. That was the second assault, and it was on a man who had only stood between him and a barrier, and it was full in the view of every camera on the avenue. I heard the crowd's sound change again, sharper now, an edge of anger in it. Somebody called out, a man's voice, "Leave them alone." Somebody else, "We can see you, we've got you on film." The mood of a crowd is a real and physical thing, and I felt it turn against the man like a tide turning, and I think, for the first time, he felt it too. He should have stopped. Even then he should have stopped, helped the marshal up, apologized, taken his lumps, driven away. Instead he did the thing that in the long run mattered more than any of it. He turned and lunged for the barrier itself, the steel section of the cordon, and got both hands on it, and began to drag it sideways out of the road, to clear his own path by force, with the drums coming and the head of the procession now in sight at the bottom of the mile, a column of slow figures and a riderless horse, and the standards lifted in the gray light. I did not let the barrier move. I stepped onto it, planted, put my weight where it would do the most good, and held the steel against the strength of a furious man. And for a few seconds it was just the two of us and a length of barrier in a contest he could not win, because I was set and braced and trained, and he was flailing and spent and increasingly aware that he was losing. He heaved. The barrier did not give. He heaved again, his face purple, a sound coming out of him now that was not words at all, and the barrier held because I held it, because that was the post, and the post was the point. "You," he gasped, "are going," another heave, "to regret," another, "this." "No, sir," I said, level, holding the steel. "I don't think I will." And then the officers arrived. They came up the pavement at a run from the south checkpoint, two of them, then a third, fast and unhurried in the way only well-trained people manage at the same time. They had heard the marshal's radio, and they had seen the last of it themselves coming up the mile. The man wrenching at a cordon barrier with a guardsman braced against it, and a marshal on the ground holding his face. There is no version of that picture that favors the man. The first officer reached him and took his wrist off the barrier with a practiced turn, and the man rounded on the officer the way he had rounded on everyone that morning, all volume and entitlement, and I heard the officer say the words, calm and clear and final. "Sir, you're under arrest on suspicion of assault and a public order offense. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention, when questioned, something you later rely on in court." The man stopped wrenching. The fight went out of his hands first, the way it always does before it goes out of the rest of a man. He stood there with an officer at each arm and stared at the barrier he had not been able to move, and at me behind it, square and silent and exactly where I had been the whole time, and I watched the truth of his mourning arrive on his face all at once. He had screamed at a road for 40 minutes, and the road had not opened. He had shoved a guard, and the guard had not fallen. He had hauled at a barrier, and the barrier had not given. Everything he had thrown his weight against had simply, patiently, declined to move. And now the only thing moving on the whole avenue was a column of slow drummers, and a man being walked backward off the King's Mile in handcuffs, while strangers filmed it. They took him to the side. They sat him on the low wall outside the assurance offices with an officer beside him, and the second officer crouched to the marshal and helped him up and checked the bruise blooming on his cheekbone. And the third got on the radio about the silver car, which was still sitting nose first against my cordon with its door open, and its hazard lights now ticking, abandoned in the middle of a closed Ceremonial avenue with the procession 90 seconds out. And here is where the post tested me hardest, harder than the shove, harder than the haul on my arm, because I wanted, with everything in me, to watch the man on the wall. I wanted to see him understand. I wanted to see the officers read him his details and find out who he was and watch the fancy coat sag as the morning closed over him. That is the small, human, ungenerous thing, and I am not ashamed to admit I felt it, because feeling it and obeying it are two different things, and the post is the discipline of the second. The drums were almost on us. My job was not to watch the man. My job was to hold the line clear so the procession could pass, and to stand the procession through with the bearing it was owed, as if no man in a good coat had ever shouted a single word. So I squared the barrier back to true where he had wrenched it. I stepped back into my length of the cordon. I brought my heels together, I brought my eyes back to the middle distance, and I became, again, the wall, exactly as if the last 6 minutes had not happened. And the drums came up the mile, and the head of the column drew level, and I gave it what it was owed. I will not describe the whole procession. It is not mine to describe, and it would slow this account, and the column deserves better than to be scenery for a story about a rude man. I will tell you only that the riderless horse came by with the empty boots reversed in the stirrups, and that the standards dipped at the cenotaph at the far end, and that the brass took up the slow air that everyone on that avenue had heard 100 times, and that nobody on that avenue could hear without their throat tightening. I stood it through. The old woman with the poppy stood it through, weeping openly now and not caring. The man with the phone had lowered it at last and taken his hat off. Even the officer beside the silver car had come to a kind of attention. And on the low wall, the man in the good coat sat in handcuffs and watched the thing he had tried to keep from happening happen anyway in front of him, untouched by him, complete without him. I did not look at him, but I knew from the change in the marshal's face as the marshal stood at the barrier and looked past me that the man was watching, and that something in him had finally gone quiet. The drum will do that. It does not argue. It simply reminds you what a road can be for, and how small a meeting looks beside it. When the tail of the column had passed, and the avenue belonged again to the ordinary morning, the officers got to their work in earnest, and I got the first piece of the picture that would, over the weeks to come, take the man's whole world down to the studs. The third officer had run the silver car's plate while we waited, and I heard her tell her colleague, low, that the registered keeper was the man on the wall, that the car was a company vehicle leased to a firm in his name, and that, more to the point, a quick check had thrown up 2 prior matters on his license already. A careless driving conviction from the spring and points still lived from a speeding offense the year before. None of that by itself was my business. But I had stood enough cordons to know what it meant in sum. A man with a thin license and a temper, who had now driven a vehicle around a road closure, abandoned it across a ceremonial cordon, assaulted a marshal, and assaulted a guard, all on camera, on a remembrance morning, in front of a crowd of witnesses who had already begun, I could see, to swap names and numbers with the officers so they could give statements. The man had not lost his temper for a moment. He had lost a great deal more than that, and it would take him a while to understand how much. They walked him to the police vehicle that had come up the now open avenue, and as they put him in, he twisted around for one last word, because men like that always have one last word, and he aimed it at me across the cordon. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers," he called. "You laid hands on me. I've got that on film too." The officer beside him said something I did not catch, something dry, and one of the witnesses on the pavement, a square-built older man who looked like he had worn a uniform himself once, laughed out loud, a single bark of disbelief. because everyone standing on that avenue knew what the film actually showed. It showed a man shoving a guard who did not move, hauling on a guard who did not move, striking a marshal who had only stood in his way, and tearing at a barrier while a guard held it true. It showed me break a grip and reclaim my ground and ask him once quietly to step behind the line. There was not one frame in which I was the aggressor, and there were a dozen phones worth of frames in which he was. He thought the cameras were his weapon. The cameras were the case against him, and they were being volunteered, that very minute, by strangers who had decided which side of the line they stood on. The police vehicle pulled away down the open mile. A recovery truck came for the silver car within the half hour and hauled it off the cordon at last. The one thing the man had wanted moved all morning finally moving, sideways on a winch, with him not in it. The marshal got an ice pack and a seat and a great deal of quiet thanks, and I stood my length of the cordon until the relief came at the end of my watch, and then I marched off, and that, for me, was the end of the morning. It was not the end of the matter. I learned the rest of it the way a guardsman learns most things, in pieces, over weeks, from the sergeant and the daybook, and eventually from a courtroom I was asked to attend. I am going to set it down plainly, because the plainness is the point. There was no thunderbolt. There was no convoy, and no colonel, and no single dramatic stroke. There was only the slow, sure machinery of consequence, turning at its own pace, fed by everything the man had done in front of everyone, and it ground exceedingly fine. The statements came first. By the end of that week, the officers had 9 of them, from 9 different members of the public, and 7 phones worth of footage handed over without anyone being asked twice. The case was, the sergeant told me with the ghost of satisfaction he allowed himself maybe twice a year, about as clean as a case gets. They did not even need my account to make it. They had it from every angle but mine. I gave a statement anyway, short and exact, because that is also the post. I wrote what happened. I wrote that he shouted, that he shoved me twice, that he took hold of my arm and tried to drag me from the cordon, that he struck the marshal, that he wrenched at the barrier, and that I broke his grip, reclaimed my ground, and instructed him once to step behind the line. I did not embroider it. The truth needed no help. Then came the charges, and they stacked the way the morning had stacked. Common assault on the marshal, assault on me. A public order offense for the screaming and the scene of it. And because the officers had not forgotten the start of it all, a driving matter. He had gone around marked road closure signage and driven a vehicle into a coned ceremonial closure. And that, set against the 2 live matters already on his license, was the loose thread that pulled the most expensive part of his life apart. Because the man, it turned out, drove for his living more than he admitted. Not a lorry, nothing so honest. He sold, and he sold across a wide territory, and the company car leased in his name was the engine of the whole arrangement. When the careless driving from the spring and the speeding points from the year before were laid alongside the closure offense from the remembrance morning, the total tipped him over the line that the law draws for people who keep accumulating it, and a court took his license away. Not a fine he could shrug off. The license itself gone, for a stretch of months that I will not pretend I can remember exactly, but long enough to matter. Long enough to make a man who lived in his car into a man who could not lawfully sit in one. I have thought about that a good deal since, because it is the part that proves the thing I believe about the post. He came to that cordon believing that the road was an obstacle and I was an obstacle and the rules were obstacles, and that a sufficiently important man could simply push obstacles aside. And the lesson the morning taught him, in the slow language of courts and licenses, was that the rules are not the obstacle. The rules are the road. They are the thing that lets a road be a road, that lets a closed avenue stay closed long enough for a column to pass, that lets a marshal stand in front of a barrier without being knocked down, that lets a man drive to his meetings at all. He had spent his fury trying to scream open one closed road on one morning, and in doing it he had closed every road to himself, for months, by his own hand. There is a justice in that, so exact it does not need a guardsman to point at it. The assaults were dealt with too in their measure. He was bound over and fined, ordered to pay compensation to the marshal, made to stand in a courtroom and hear a magistrate describe his conduct in the dry, devastating way magistrates have, which is worse than any shouting because it is so calm and so final and so unimpressed. I was there for part of it. I sat at the back in plain clothes, which felt strange, a guard out of his red, and I watched the man across the room, and he was smaller than I remembered, the way these men always are once the volume is taken away from them. He did not look at me. There was no triumph in it for me, and I want to be honest about that. I felt no thrill of victory. I felt the quiet that comes when a thing has been set right, not by anyone's anger, but by the ordinary working of the world when it is allowed to work. The system had come, exactly as I had trusted it would when I held the line and gave him nothing to fight. The wall had only to be a wall long enough. The rest took care of itself. His lawyers, I should add, never wrote to me. There was, of course, nothing to write. The film he had been so sure would save him was played in that courtroom, and it showed precisely what every witness on the avenue had already seen, and the only hands laid on anyone that morning were his. There was the matter of the firm, too, which I heard of only second-hand, and which I set down here because it completes the shape of the thing. The company whose car he drove did not care for the footage, and the footage by then had traveled. One of the witnesses had put a short clip online before any of us could have stopped it. Not the worst of it, just the shove and the unmoved guard and the silver car, and it had been watched a great many times by people who knew exactly what they were looking at. A man trying to bully his way onto a closed road on a morning of all mornings, and failing. The clip carried the company's name on the side of the car as plainly as it carried his face. A firm can survive a great deal, but it cannot easily survive being the firm whose man shoved a guard at a remembrance service while the whole avenue watched. He was, the sergeant told me with no relish at all, let go before the court had even finished with him. The territory he had driven for so many years was given to someone steadier. The car was someone else's now. He had walked off the King's Mile that morning having lost the road, and by the time the leaves turned he had lost the license, the position, the company car, and the reputation that came with all three, and every piece of it traced straight back to 6 minutes in which he could not bear to wait behind a line. The prosecutor put it best, I thought, in the dry summing up I half heard from the back of the room. She said the case was not, in the end, about a closed road or a missed meeting. It was about a man who believed the rules were for other people, and who learned, in the only language he had left himself able to understand, that they were not. I have carried that sentence with me. It is, near enough, the creed of the post, spoken by a woman who had never stood one. There was one more thing, and it is the part I keep. A few weeks after the court business was done, the sergeant called me in and slid a letter across the desk. It had come through the proper channels, addressed to the regiment, and it was from the older woman with the poppy. I knew her at once from the careful, old-fashioned hand. She wrote that she had been at the King's Mile that morning, that she had lost a brother long ago whose name was among the 11 read at the cenotaph, and that she had been afraid, when the shouting started, that the morning was going to be spoiled, taken from her and from the others by a stranger who did not understand what the road was for. And then she wrote, she had watched a guardsman stand absolutely still through all of it, and refuse to be moved and refuse to be drawn, and hold the line so that the drums could come and the column could pass and her brother could be remembered properly, on time, in peace, as he was owed. She wrote that she had not known until that morning that stillness could be a kind of protection. She wrote that she would not forget it. And she thanked me, not for putting the man down because I had not, but for not needing to. I have stood a great many watches, and I expect to stand a great many more, and most of them pass without a word, which is how they are supposed to pass. People walk by the red tunic and the bearskin, and they take their photographs, and they wonder, I think, what is going on behind the face, whether there is anything there at all or just a man playing a statue for the tourists. I will tell you what is there. There is a man holding a line. There is a man for whom the stillness is not the absence of effort, but the whole of it. There is a man who has learned that the hardest strength is the strength you do not use, and that the surest way to lose a road is to fight for it like the man in the good coat fought, and the surest way to keep it is to stand on it, and let the noise break against you until the noise has spent itself and gone. He wanted me to move. He shouted at me to move, and he shoved me to move, and he hauled at me to move, and he hauled at the barrier to move it, and not one of those things moved, because that morning my whole duty was to be the thing that did not move, and I was it. The road he could not scream open stayed closed for the dead until the dead were done with it, and then it opened on its own, the way roads do in their proper time. And I stood my length of it through all of it, eyes forward, chin level, and gave him nothing but a wall. That is the post. That is the whole of it. A man comes at you with everything he has, certain that the world rearranges itself around his importance, and you give him a wall, and the wall holds, and in the holding the world is reminded quietly that it does not. The discipline is the protection. The stillness is the answer, and a road that is held for a good reason cannot be screamed open by a man who has forgotten what roads are for.